everyone, and welcome back to Walcott Fine Art. So today I'm going to talk about limited versus non-limited palettes. And again, this was a suggestion from a viewer who wanted me to talk about this subject. So again, thank you for the suggestion. So when an artist is starting out learning how to paint, so this is, especially geared toward beginners, you go to the art store and there's this overwhelming selection of all these different colors, and you think to yourself, how many do I really need? So maybe you don't buy enough because you're trying to save money and you don't want to spend a lot. Or some artists might do the opposite and think, well, I need to get every color and they're all so pretty on the shelf, and then you end up buying way more than you need. And so when you're first starting out as an artist, it's tempting to want to buy all these different colors, and but if you have too many colors on your palette, and you're not sure how to use them exactly, then it can become overwhelming, and your painting can become like too out of control in terms of the color, and then it doesn't look good. So a lot of teachers and art instructors will say, we'll start with a limited palette. But then sometimes they can go to that extreme too much, and then they're limiting the beginner artist, and who becomes frustrated because they can't mix the kind of colors that they're trying to mix because they have too few. So I want to discuss today, I'll kind of show you some examples of some very limited palettes that you can try if you want. And then I'll give you a recommendation if you're just starting out for what I think is the perfect beginning palette for artists who are just starting out, that has the right balance of color range, but not overwhelming you too much and making you spend too much money on paints and stuff. So, and then of course, once an artist is working, for many years, each artist develops his or her own, palette of colors that's unique to them, that they like. If you look at all different artists' palettes, you'll find that there's some commonalities between them. But then a lot of artists will have, swear by this color, or they have to have this color and that color. So let's get started. And I think probably I'm going to start out with the most extreme example of a simplified limited palette that I know of or can think of, in terms of the colors used. And that's what's called the Zorn palette. And these are the colors right here. And they were used by an artist named Anders Zorn, who lived in the late 19th and earliest 20th century. And so supposedly these are the only 4 colors that he used. And they're white, black, yellow ochre, and he used vermilion, but I've substituted that here for cadmium red light, because they're essentially the same color. And vermilion nowadays is hard to get and it's very expensive, but it's essentially the same color as cadmium red light. So white, black, yellow ochre, cadmium red light. That's it. So this is what's known as the Zorn palette. Now, I've never used this, but it would be fun to experiment with if you were curious. But it's definitely going to be very limited in its color range. So it really pushes an artist to really use color, really have a good knowledge of color and value. And in the hands of a really skilled artist, this palette can give the illusion of containing a lot of color. So just to show you some of the mixes it makes, of course there's black. So if you have the black and you mix that with white, that's going to essentially act as your blue primary. The yellow ochre, of course, is your yellow. And then the cadmium red light is going to be your red component. Now, the one color that you're never going to get out of this palette, you know, you're never going to get really rich, vibrant, saturated secondary colors. You know, so if you mix the Cadmium Red Light and the Yellow Ochre, that is basically, that's going to be the orange that you're going to get from this palette. And if you mix the Yellow Ochre with the black, that's going to be the green that you get out of this palette. And then if you mix the black with a little bit of the Cadmium Red Light, then that's going to be your violet that you're going to get out of this palette. And so you can kind of see when you look at it that that's orange, green, and violet, you know, but it's very, 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 very dull and very, very, you know, unsaturated. But that is what's known as the Zorn palette. And so if you practice with that a lot, you can get, you know, through these limited sort of muted colors. And, you know, if you have a good command of the values in it, you know, you can sort of get a lot of color range out of that. And I've seen, you know, if you look at, I'll put an example up here of a painting by Anders Zorn. So you can see in this painting how he really makes fantastic use of that palette. But again, this palette is very limiting, but you do get a fair amount of range here, as you can see, you know, surprisingly more than you'd think. So moving on, another very limited palette you could use if you wanted to start out was a more traditional one of yellow, blue, and red. So what I have out here is Cadmium Yellow Light, Ultramarine Blue, and Pyrrol Red. And these are more traditional primaries, like the kind that you learned in school. You could also substitute these three with the CMYK primaries, like they use in printing, which would be Cadmium Lemon, Cobalt Teal, and Quinacridone Magenta. So if you use Magenta, Lemon Yellow, and then a teal color or light blue. You could also use cerulean blue here, or cerulean blue hue. But these three are what they use for printing, like the CMYK printing primaries. So you could also use that. This is kind of a variation of this, and these will give you like a more saturated secondaries. But for the sake of painting, you know, these three aren't as typical, so for the sake of painting, we'll take a look at the more traditional ones here today. So obviously you have your Cadmium Yellow Light, your Ultramarine Blue, and then this Pyrrol Red. So if we mix those with a little white, we can see they're, oops, mix that with a little white, we can see how they look mixed with white, which is always helpful. Because it so this is a color palette that's going to be more along the lines of what you're used to, but again, it is still going to be limited because, you know, even though you've got more saturated primaries here, you know, the color biases of these three primaries are still going to make it a little difficult to achieve a full really full range of colors. So we can mix some of these together and see what we get. So we mix the red and yellow. We do get a nice orange from this. Let's see a little more yellow here. We do get a nice orange from that. If we take a little yellow and mix it with blue. We get a okay green, and then this blue and red to make violet. You'll get an okay violet, but not a great one. Let's add a little. You know what? Let's add a little more red in there. So this will be a little bit easier to get a more range of brighter colors from. So then if we mix these with white, we can see what we've got here. Yes. So this is the more traditional saturated primary palette of Cadmium Yellow Light, Ultramarine Blue, and Pyrrol Red. And so you can kind of see the range of tones we have in there. So let's move on and take a look at the palette that I recommend if you're just starting out and you want to not buy too many paints, but you want a good range of colors. It's what I call the split primary palette. Okay, so what I've got here in front of me is what is called the split primary palette. And if someone came to me and said, Jason, what is the best somewhat limited palette for a beginning artist to use who's never painted before and doesn't want to go to the art store and spend a lot of money, what's the best minimum palette that you would recommend? This would be the one that I would recommend. And it consists of 6 chromatic colors plus black and white. So that means if you're just starting out and you're going to the art store, you only have 8 tubes of paint to buy, and this will give you the greatest range of color, but still keep it simplified. And I'll explain what this is. And so a split primary palette basically is you have a warm and cool version of each primary. So for the yellow, you have Cadmium Lemon, which is your cool yellow, Cadmium Yellow Deep, which is your warm yellow, Cadmium Red Light, which is your warm red, Quinacridone Magenta, which is your cool red, Ultramarine, which is your cool blue, and Phthalo Blue, which is your warm blue. Now we can get into a big argument about whether Ultramarine is warm and Phthalo is cool, or Phthalo is what, blah 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 blah. And I've heard it both ways. I've heard artists talk about it both ways. For me personally, I feel like Ultramarine Blue is cool and Phthalo Blue is warm. But if you have both of these on your palette, that doesn't really matter so much, as it will still give you the color range that you need. And the reason that this palette works the way it does is because each of these, because one's warm, one's cool, each of these has that color bias. So you're going to get the cleanest mixes that you can get from them. So a cool yellow, like this lemon yellow here, already leans toward green. It's a little, ever so slightly greenish. So if you use this yellow to mix your greens, and then you use Phthalo Blue, which is already a greenish blue that leans toward green, because these both have a tiny little bit of green in them, this yellow and this blue are going to make the brightest green. So let's take a look at an example. The Phthalo Blue is very strong, so you just need a little of it. But see, that's a nice, bright, saturated, very nice green. And the reason you're getting that nice, bright, saturated green is, again, because both this blue and this yellow lean toward green already. So if you were to mix, let's say, let's do the opposite. Now this Cadmium Yellow Deep and the Ultramarine Blue, both of those lean toward red. And red is the opposite of green. So if you mix a yellow that has a little tiny bit of red in it, and a blue that has a tiny little bit of red in it, that reddishness is going to cancel out the green, and you'll get a really dull green. So now you can see this is much more of a desaturated olive green than this one is. But now you could combine the lemon with the ultramarine, or the phthalo with the cadmium yellow deep, for yet two more greens that are in between these two. Then you mix those with black and white. Now you see, you've just given yourself a huge range of greens with the split primary palette. And the same thing is going to apply to the other secondaries. So you'll get a wide range of oranges from different combinations of these two yellows and two reds. And you'll get, a range of violets combining the two blues with the two reds. So, for example, let's take a quick look. If you want to make a nice orange, and you combine Cadmium Yellow Deep with Cadmium Red Light, you're going to get a pretty nice orange because both of those colors already lean toward orange. Likewise, as with the green, if you have Quinacridone Magenta, which leans toward blue because it's slightly purplish, and Cadmium Lemon, which leans toward green, aka blue, because it's just ever so slightly greenish, the blue in those is going to again cancel out the orange because blue is the complement of orange. So then you're going to get an orange that's far more muted. Try to get into the values the same. So you can see that still looks very orange, but the orange is just slightly muted compared to this orange. And that's one of the reasons I don't recommend just the really simple lemon yellow, magenta, cyan palette, because your orange range is going to be limited. More so than this one. And then if you want to do a violet, ultramarine blue plus the quinacridone is going to give you a nice violet. Mix that with a little white so we can see what it looks like. Yeah, see, that's a pretty nice violet. And then if you wanted a more muted violet, you could go with the Phthalo Blue. And the Cadmium Red Light, and you're going to get something that's almost brown at that point. Because it really is very dull. So that's the advantage of a split primary palette, is it gives you all those ranges from the nice, clean, really saturated secondaries to the more dull, muted secondaries, and everything in between. And yet you only, when you go to the store, see, look how muted that is when you mix it with white. When you go to the store, you only have to buy 8 colors, so you're not buying this whole, huge range of different colors. So now the palette I use that I've sort of honed over the years is actually based on this, and then to this I've added a few earth colors, and then my genuine Naples yellow, which I like a lot because it's a very handy color. But those sort of supplemental colors you add in later, once you realize, okay, I have a need for this, or I have a need for that. And I also keep single pigment primaries on hand, just in case I need a really super bright, single pigment secondaries. I keep single pigment secondaries on hand in case I need a really bright, saturated pop of color. So I have cadmium orange, phthalo green, and oxazine violet, just in case I need those. Because a single pigment is going to be just a little brighter and cleaner than a mix. But as you can see, this purple made from Quinacridone Magenta and Ultramarine Blue is a really nice violet. So I recommend to beginners just starting out to use the split primary palette. So you've got 6 chromatic colors plus black and white to adjust your values. And then later, after you get used to working for a while and you find, okay, I'm missing this area of color over here, then you can add things in. But starting out, I wouldn't recommend a super limited palette because that's too limiting and you're going to get frustrated. And at the same token, I would not recommend going out and buying like 28 or 29 different colors, because you're never going to need that many, and it's just you're going to end up suffering from overwhelm. So I hope that this video demonstrated a somewhat limited palette with a good range for you, and I thank you for watching. See you next time. Thanks so much for watching. Go ahead and click on that subscribe button so you won't miss the next video. And why not spread the joy? Be sure to share my videos on your favorite social media. Don't forget to head on over to my website, walcottfineart.com, where you can see my art, read my blog, or when you join my newsletter list, you can win free art. Every month, I'll choose a lucky winner for my email list, and that person will receive a mini original oil painting. There's a chance to win every month, so be sure to sign up today so you don't miss out. Plus, you'll get my fun newsletter. See you next time!